What's happening, everybody? Welcome to the Paranormies present the Ahnenerbe Hour. I am Johnny Monoxide, and tonight I'm joined by Adam Haidt. What's up, Adam?
Hey.
And Larry Ridgeway. What's up, Larry?
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. And that's it for the panel tonight. A little small panel. Big topic, small panel. Very important to the paranormal and the weird, supernatural, and all that, and actually to science. So,
oh yeah,
very
and Harry Potter.
And,
oh yeah.
Oh, I was saving that. I was saving
Harry
that.
Potter episode. I'm gonna discuss the canon and the fanfic that I wrote for about 10 hours tonight.
Amren.
Nice. Amren Borther. Yeah, we're gonna talk about Harry Potter, and we're gonna talk about. I can't even.
Twilight.
We're not doing fucking Harry Potter. Knock it off,
Dude. I was gonna say your audience is always like bitching about how you guys don't do the Holocaust episode. Then they listen to the beginning of this, and you say, "Oh, we're gonna do Harry Potter." They're like, "These fucking people!" Like,
I fucking hate you. What the fuck? I hate Johnny and the guys now.
You can't do the Holocaust. This is supposed to be anti-Semitic shit here, but you guys are like Philo Harry Potter people. Like,
we are not Philo Harry Potter people. No, not gross.
Well
All
done.
Right.
10 points to Haight House.
That's right. 10. Oh, they. Well, we're back. The Hollow Planets, Hollow Earth episode 1 came out this week. Man, that was fun, huh, guys? Sitting around listening to Jan Lamprecht.
yeah,
Jan is a fascinating guy. I'm really glad that we were able to get him to come on.
Yeah, he hasn't talked
nice.
about. He hasn't talked about Hollow Earth in about 14 years or 13. Whenever that Nexus conference was, 2003. So it's about 14. It'll be 15 years this year. And he wants to, he wants to talk about his book and the whole concept. And he decided that Paranormies are going to be his vessel. So, hey, I am honored. Even if we did talk about Rampa.
Rampa.
Lopsang Rampa. I can never pronounce that correctly. The phony Lopsang Rampa. All right, that's enough about that. We also we had our series a couple weeks ago with the Jews Ruin Everything, part 1 with Christianity in the Church. We're going to get into more of that eventually. We're going to have so we're going to talk about how the Jews literally have ruined basically everything. If you can come up with something they haven't ruined, I bet you I can find that you're wrong.
Those.
Yeah, well, you can't ruin something they invented. I mean, well, actually, but we have a few other series that we're gonna get into eventually. I'm not gonna tell you what those are, but they're coming up. One of them being the Holocaust. I promise. I swear to God, I promise. We have guests that we want to get on, and one of them is. I hope he's not listening, but one of them's a pain in the ass, and you know who I'm talking about, Adam. He made me buy his book. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so we're gonna have some guests discuss the Holocaust. We'll probably end up doing at least a 3-part series on it. So stay tuned, Goyam. I promise it's coming. Another announcement: the T-shirts. A lot of you guys got your logo shirts, the Keck / whatever you want to call it, the Ghostbusters thing, whatever, the season 3. Those are done. The guy, the I Need Merch guy, had an issue with his printer, and he ended up getting backed up. And the Fascination guys got backed up. Seventh Son had some shirts that are backed up, and of course, Paranormies being the low podcast on the totem pole, our skull t-shirts got backed up. They are coming. I just got an email yesterday that my personal order is being shipped this week, so everybody else's is being shipped this week as well. I am very sorry, Goyam. Please accept our humblest apologies here from the Paranormies. Sorry. Very sorry. More positive note, we got a couple of donations. Since we started, I don't want to talk about coins this week, but we got a donation for $100 in Litecoin. How about that?
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I can't find the email that went along with it, so I can't thank the man properly. When I got to look through it, it might have gotten deleted or something. But you know who you are. You donated $100 in Litecoin. I really appreciate it, Goy. We're making it. We're shitcoining with it, and we're gonna make it into $1 bazillion and buy Lamborghinis for the entire panel. Hey, we started off with microphones.
Yeah.
We got a donation from Mary for $25. Thank you, Mary. And we got a donation from a very special guys. You're not gonna believe who this is from. It's Uncle Adolf.
What?
Uncle Adolf donated $88.14 to the Paranormies.
Oh, thanks, Uncle Adolf.
Right? And he left a little message. He said, never slacken, never tire, never lose courage, and never lose faith. How about that? Uncle
All
Adolf.
right.
Hail victory.
From the grave.
From the center of the hollow earth. Settle down, Larry. We're getting ahead of ourselves.
Right, yes.
We're getting ahead of ourselves on that. We have emails. We'll probably save those for later because I kind of want to get into tonight's topic. Adam has spent a good bit of time researching tonight's topic. I've read up on it a lot in the past. It is something that a lot of us who are into the paranormal are very much into even in the scientific community, not just the paranormal. We are going to be talking about alchemy. How about that?
Alchemy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot about the history of it, and from a fairly secular point of view. I wanted to get that covered before we get too deep into the symbolic, the psychic, the occult, this sort of self-transformative and supernatural aspects of it. Because at its root, alchemy really a totally 100% natural art. It was it's not intended to be magic, at least how it was developed. So you want to hop into it?
Yeah, let's go. Let's do it.
All right. Well, it is, technically speaking, even though it is not a supernatural art, or at least it wasn't developed that way initially, it is still esoterica. It is occult in the sense of being hidden knowledge. This was, if you really think about it, turning metals into like other metals, turning lead into gold, like you'd want to keep that secret. So in the past 40 years really has been an explosion of information coming out. People have been writing a lot more about it. New texts have been found. All sorts of things are coming to bring all this information together to get a better understanding of how alchemy was developed in the past. And generally, it's agreed upon that there were four main historical periods of alchemy. There was the first one, which was the greco-egyptian period, about the 3rd to 9th century. Then the Arabic alchemy, sort of, not a revival because it hadn't died there yet, but it really took off big in the Arabic world after the rise of Islam, and when Islam conquered a whole bunch of formerly sort of, I guess you'd call them European lands. You know what I'm talking about. Egypt, parts of the Mediterranean, Spain, that kind of thing.
Whoa,
That was the 8th to 15th century.
Egypt, European? Are you saying that they weren't black?
We was Kangs.
No.
As a matter of fact,
it was as a matter of fact. Go ahead, Adam.
My melaninated brother, we were kings. Yeah, that's right. Egypt, I mean, it's pretty much like a Greek colony, a Roman colony.
Yeah, I don't need to speak like a nig here. We were kings. We are kings.
We were pharaohs.
We are the champions, No time for losers, am I right?
That's right.
The thing about that is when we do our Egypt episode or episodes, because that is one that could also become a small series, we're going to really get into the kings aspect of Egypt. So yes, they were European. Cleopatra was from Greece, and
they were Mediterranean.
Mediterranean.
The ruling class was certainly Mediterranean.
King Tut's DNA is from like Western France, I believe. It was his maternal haplogroup is from France.
It's just so crazy that why would they about like those people being niggers, dude? It just doesn't make any sense.
It's sad, but I'm glad we are able to, or we're gonna clear it up a lot more. But yeah, it's maybe a big shock to some of our listeners, but in fact, we were the kings. But anyway, so after the sort of Arabic 15th century, they sort of had their way with alchemy. It was passed back to sort of the Western Latin Europe in the 12th to 15th century, and sort of became the Golden Age, as it's called, in the 16th to 18th century. Again, that was also in Europe. So after the Arabic world was kind of, had their way with alchemy, they passed it back to Latin Europe as sort of Western Europe in the 12th to 15th century, and then it flourished in the Golden Age of the 16th to 18th century, and that was also in Europe. And I personally will not be covering Chinese or Hindu or other sort of Asian, like Eastern world alchemy on this episode. One common misconception, Western alchemists were not really interested in immortality. And my personal theory on it, which is I pretty much just made up right now, is probably because they were largely Christian. And so like being immortal wasn't interesting to them, whereas the Chinese actually were. That was one of the goals of alchemy in China. So just go ahead.
I was going to say in India too. That was one of the things in India too. It wasn't just making gold in India. It was them wanting to live forever. But yeah. Well, we can, when we get into a second part of this, we can talk about the other schools of alchemy besides the West.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just real quick, talk about the etymology of it, because it sounds like alchemy. It's kind of similar to chemistry. They probably came from the same root. Zosimos of Panopolis, who I'll get to him in a little bit, he refers to some early alchemists that he called chemists or chemists, and at another point he claimed that alchemy was revealed by an angel in a book called Kamen, and he probably got the idea of the angel like bringing mankind a book like that. He probably got that from the Book of Enoch. But really it probably comes from the Greek word cheo or cheo. I don't know how to pronounce Greek or Latin words, so you'll have to forgive me. But it means to melt or fuse, and kuma means an ingot of metal. So that's probably where it came from. And the al part comes from just I believe it's the definite article from Arabic, like al. So anyway, like I said, the first real alchemists were greco-egyptian. And when it really began, it wasn't trying to like do anything impossible. I mean, they didn't realize that turning metals into other metals was impossible. But they started out as just like an artisanal craft. I mean, metallurgy was thousands and thousands of years old at that point. I think like even in the first century AD, metallurgy was like 4,000 years old. Like people knew in the West, at least, they knew how to work with metal. They could make all kinds of like really fantastic stuff. In the earliest documents by these people who they weren't really alchemists yet, but that was where kind of alchemy came from, as this group of people. the documents that they had for their art, they generally had 4 categories, like working with gold, working with silver, precious gems, and textile dyes. And what a lot of them were really interested in was just counterfeiting. They wanted to figure out ways to make silver look like gold, so they could rip people off. To make gold look like silver. I'm not really sure why you'd want to do that, but they would do things like try to make artificial pearls, artificial emeralds, and cheaper purple dyes. At the time, purple dye was one of the most expensive items on the planet because it had to be extracted from these snails. It was very costly, very, very costly in terms of time and resources.
Yeah, and purple was obviously the color of royalty, so it would be worth more if something was purple as opposed to red or brown or black or whatever. So yeah, so making things, counterfeiting purple cloth was a high ticket item there for these people.
Oh yeah,
it's kind of hard. I mean, it's not kind of hard, but it's interesting that it comes from basically trying to rip people off. I mean, they were trying to Jew people out of their stuff. I mean, I wonder if there's a Semitic sort of aspect to alchemy at all.
Well, I'll get actually to something like that coming up a little bit. But these people, like they already were skilled in working with like the real versions of this stuff, you know. That's why they were interested in counterfeiting it at all. Like these were artisans.
Right.
And,
they knew the value of the real stuff, so to counterfeit it would be, make more money, higher profit margins.
And they would already know a lot about it. They kind of have like a head start on figuring out how to cheat people with this stuff, since they were probably already doing it anyway. There was a couple of papyri, I guess that's how it's pronounced, that were discovered in the 1800s from this era, and they're in these museums in Leiden and Stockholm, and so they're just called the Leiden Stockholm papyri. So here's one cool recipe actually that they had in the Leiden papyrus. It's the 87th recipe from this this text, and it's some sulfur, some lime in equal proportion, and some vinegar or urine, which the author of the book I read said that because they tried it, they said that the urine worked a lot better. So you take that, you boil it all until it looks like blood, you filter out the sediments, and then you put silver in it, and it will change silver. It'll start turning kind of tawny, and then it'll start to look like gold, and then it'll get a kind of a coppery color as you leave it in there. It'll turn bronzy, and then like a weird purple, and then finally it'll just turn brown and stay that way. And so you can kind of guess what the point of that recipe was, right? Making silver look like gold. And so if you were pretty well practiced in doing this kind of thing, like you could consistently pull off like these kind of scams, make a little silver ring, mix up this thing, put it in there, and then boom, you got a gold ring, gold.
Right.
Not really, but that's the kind of thing that they were doing. And it's kind of sad. Those papyri are the only like original documents that survived from that time. And most of the documents from that time were anthologies. They were just sort of best ofs of whatever recipes they weren't really alchemists at the time, any of these artisans could get. They would compile them together. There was the Corpus Alchemicum Graecum, which was like a whole bunch of anthologies that were compiled by the Byzantine scholars in the 11th century. So, of course, they were only recording stuff that they thought was important. And then there was one compiled by someone named Democritus, who was not the... Yeah, Democritus. He was not the 5th century philosopher, someone who used that name. And it was called Physica Kai Mystica, which means the natural and secret things. And this guy had an interesting story, too. He he tried to like seance his master, because his master died before telling him all the secrets. And so he writes in this book that he basically just tried attempting to contact his dead master, and he was sort of successful. He was talking to his master's ghost, who said that he couldn't tell him any information across the void, but he told him if he checks in the temple, that there would be there'd be something in there. And when he went there, he found in one of the pillars had moved. There was a message that said, "Nature delights in nature. Nature triumphs over nature, and nature masters nature." And I think this illustrates the point I was making earlier, that this was not magic to them. They thought this was like a totally natural scientific thing. It was just, it was like metallurgy. Someone had to figure out how to do it at some point. And that's kind of the position that alchemists thought they were in generally, that they were trying to figure out this natural thing, not trying to do magic. So it wasn't really until about the end of the 3rd century that people wanted to actually make real gold and silver instead of just counterfeiting. And this art, which the Greek, it's called chrysopoeia, just means gold making. It's in Greek that it just means gold making. Mm-hmm. And that's pretty much when alchemy as we know it was began. And it kind of came out of this, Greek philosophical milieu, where you had these artisans who were already, doing all these little experiments and these chemical reactions to various materials that they were working with. And that sort of went in with this Greek philosophical questioning of the nature of matter and these sorts of things. And someone got the idea, it was like, whoa, why don't we just, maybe we could figure out a way to actually make real gold and silver. A lot of Greeks had the idea that everything was like made of the same thing, kind of called monism, and that only the appearance of things changes. So no matter what material you have, at its most fundamental, it's all made of the same stuff, and it just has different properties, sort of. And a lot of different Greeks had their theories on what the most fundamental sort of form of matter was. Thales, I guess. I don't know if he'd pronounced Talus or Thales. He thought it was water. Democritus, the actual philosopher, not the fake guy who used his name, he thought it was atoms. Pretty, that's kind of where the idea of atoms came from. So that guy was really ahead of the curve. Aristotle thought it was prime matter, which pretty abstract, and Empedocles thought it was fire, water, earth, air. So this kind of thing. They thought, since everything was made out of the same thing anyway, that they could figure out a way to sort of change the superficial, so to speak, aspects of it, and they could turn, one metal into another.
Right.
And the real, go ahead.
Well, that, like you said, that was like what the main purpose of alchemy was in the beginning, was to transmutate metal from one form to another, one of the base metals to the noble metals, lead into mm-hmm. gold, silver into gold, pretty much everything into gold.
Yeah. Because, why would you want anything else? If you could turn lead into gold, like, why would you turn gold into lead, right?
Right. Well, you don't want to shoot gold bullets, but yeah, I could, anyways, that's a whole other.
Yeah. So the grandfather of alchemy was Zosimos of Panopolis. He was born in a city in Upper Egypt called Panopolis. It's now called Achim. And so he was not the first gold-making alchemist. This guy was like he really got it started as an intellectual thing. He really popularized it. But he wasn't the first gold maker. In fact, he refers to other gold makers before him, chrysopoeans, if you will. He wrote a lot of books, which of course most of them were lost. But there's one that survived called On Apparatus and Furnaces. And this was kind of, it's the only one we really have So of course it's the biggest thing that he produced from our perspective. But it gives some pretty cool insights.
What's the source? What's the source on that, Adam?
Of what?
One source on apparatus and furnaces.
Oh, that's the only document of his that survived. I mean, there's other stuff, but that one, and it's
Maria.
a complete.
Maria.
Oh yeah, one of the sources he has that he cites in his intellectual resources is Maria the Jew. Yeah.
Maria the Jew. I have it on good authority.
Yeah. But she actually, well, according to the story goes, she invented the idea of using a hot water bath to heat things more evenly, which is a legitimate technique. I mean, I've done that in a lab. But on apparatus and furnaces was really a big deal because he was turning alchemy from just an art that people did to make money that in a workshop because, they were trying to rip people off or whatever, and he turned it into a research science. He was really thorough in describing all these different apparatus for like distilling different things, for sublimating, which just means turning a solid into a gas. If you've seen like dry ice and you see that like vapors coming off of it, it's sublimating. There's no liquid at any point there. It goes straight from solid to gas. He described these like filtering apparatus, this sort of thing. He talks about how to do research and certain theoretical principles you should look out for while you're doing it. So it was not just blind sort of, grab some stuff out of the shelf, throw it together, and then see what happens. Like at this point, they were being systematic about it. They were being it was trial and error, but it was, they were making educated guesses about what they should try next based on what they've observed in the past. I mean, it was a science. Now, Zosimos had the idea that metals had a body and a spirit. This was the kind of theory that he was working with, where the body was just plain, like every metal had the same body. That was like the bulk of it. And it was the spirit that contained all the properties, like its color and its melting point and this kind of thing. And so his idea was that you could use fire to separate the spirit out of it somehow, and then take that spirit and displace the spirit of, like, say you were able to distill gold spirit. You could take that and put it in some lead to displace the lead spirit, and it would turn into gold. You see what I mean? Does that make sense? What the theory that he had on how it would work. So he was really interested in how vapors interacted with solids, which is pretty cool. And he recognized that when he reacted substances, that they would change. It wasn't just that, like, you take a little red, you take a little blue, and it makes it purple. It wasn't an average of these two substances. Something new was actually created. He recognized that even that early on, which is really amazing. A testament to how thorough and how keen these early scientists were. And he called transmutation tinging, because it was changing the color, basically, of the metal. These different metals had very distinct appearance, and they were sort of fixated on that, and at least in terms of how they described what they were doing. And so his transmutagens, the things that he created to try and transmute metals, he called them tinctures, which is like a dye, sort of. Let's see here. So as I mentioned earlier, alchemists had a pretty big obsession with secrecy, and that has made it very difficult for modern scholars to develop theories and understand what they're looking at when they happen to find alchemical texts. Is that these alchemists, you know, they were sneaky. They didn't want just anybody to know this stuff, because if what they were doing was true, like if somebody actually figured out how to turn lead into gold, that's a big, you could ruin an economy with that. And so they were very secretive. They didn't want their rivals or anybody
inflation
see fit. Yeah, they wanted to be able to control this knowledge.
There's so much about this. There's so much about alchemy so far that just seems really, really coincidental, if you know what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyway, no, please continue. But real quick though, now we're still. That's all we're talking about is the transmutation of gold still. Like we haven't gotten into, right. Okay.
Yeah. Just trying to change, into gold, into silver, this kind of thing. They were obsessed with secrecy. They would play with the names, you know, they might use a certain name at one point, but really the idea is that when you're initiated, you would know what they're really meaning by that.
Well, weren't there basically like alchemical orders, like of, you know, there were like these scientists basically. There were these alchemists who had apprentices and, you know, and like groups of them, and they kind of all worked together, right?
Yeah, definitely by the Latin like the Latin European period, sort of after the 12th century, that was definitely a big thing. And even like the Freemasons and the Rosicrucians and stuff in Germany in the 1770s, 1780s, they really took a hold of alchemy. But yeah, they were trying to keep, you know, control of who would know stuff. Like Zosimos, he introduces his text on apparatus with this story of these 5 dreams he had, where in these visions, there was, you know, a chemical vessel, like an altar, and then men made of copper, silver, lead, other things. They were like violently dismembered, and Zosimos would have conversations with them, and he recorded what happened. And, you know, he kind of slyly implies like, these are the recipes if you know how to interpret what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Zosimos, he was actually he was kind of a Gnostic too. The Gnostics, they had this idea that like demons pretty much were responsible for the fall of man. And in his book on apparatus, he actors, and he basically says, listen, these guys are all deceived by demons. Like, they think that they can do this stuff without my methods. No, they're wrong. Demons are making them hallucinate and think that they're doing it correctly, but no, you have to do it my way. So I thought that was kind of funny. Well,
the Gnostics, like Paracelsus, you know, they weren't really into the transmutation of gold. There's a quote from Paracelsus, says, "Take it not amiss that the alchemy I teach yields neither gold nor silver, but look upon it as the key which opens the arcana of medicine to you." So that gets into the more like
he was really...
Whoa, you just broke up really bad. I'm sorry, Adam. Say that again.
Oh, I was just saying Paracelsus was a really fascinating guy, really interesting character, like very would have been interesting to meet. Very bombastic.
Definitely. Yeah, and he comes from the Gnostic side of alchemy as opposed to the what would you call it? Just basically the I don't know, the monetary
like
side of it.
Gold making?
The gold making, yeah, like the transmutation. I mean, yeah, but like Paracelsus was more into like the biological science of it, in you know, in your soul and your spirit and your body and whatever.
Yeah, and extracting medicines from various like plants and stuff. I mean, he was doing pharmaceuticals. I don't know what the you know what I mean.
Pharmacology.
Yeah, he was doing pharmacological stuff.
Way back, yeah, and that was very interesting to me, that how advanced he was with that.
Yeah, just for the record, for the listener, Paracelsus was in the later Latin European, like like past the, I think, the 1500s after that, right? I'll have to look at my notes.
I have to look too. I don't. My notes.
Anyway, he wasn't from
the
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Period.
Yes. No, he was not. He was not. Yes, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So Zosimus, funny dude. He was like talking shit about people that disagreed with him. Let's see here. Okay, and that's pretty much greco-egyptian alchemy. I mean, obviously there were other alchemists, there was other stuff there, but Zosimos, he was really like the big name you got to know if you're talking about greco-egyptian alchemy. So the sort of Arabic period, so this is about 750 AD to 1400 AD. Like most alchemists, a lot of their texts were lost. They just destroyed in the process of history. And it wasn't really until the late 1800s when Marcellin Berthelot published the Corpus Alchemicum that it sort of revitalized interest in the Arabic alchemical period. And of course it starts about when Islam stormed the world. In 640 AD, Alexandria in Egypt was conquered and was forced into the Islamic Empire. And in 661 AD, Muawiyah, the second caliph, he made Damascus the capital of the Umayyad dynasty. And really, what's important about that is that it was in a central location, and so it had contact with the Mediterranean world, it had contact with Europe, it had contact with North Africa, it had contact with the Middle Eastern area. This was a major nexus geographically. So one problem with being a tribe of violent, illiterate, warlike cousin fucking Arabs is when you conquer a place.
Sorry,
you don't know what.
Sorry, you said cousin fucking. That I almost spit my drink across my computer. So, yeah.
You don't know how to run empires very well. Right. So all these places that were conquered, they were, a lot of former Byzantine Empire. They showed up, they broke some stuff, they killed some people, and all the people that were doing the administering at that point were like, "Hey, listen, buddy. You got the big brawn, we'll be the big brains. Let us handle the administration for you." And so that's what happened. These like Byzantine Christians, a lot wider people were kind of running all the administrative tasks and that sort of thing. And that's when a translation movement to start taking all these Greek texts and bring them to the Arab world was started. And Baghdad actually was the center of this in 762, I think, when Baghdad was founded. But that's the place where most of the translation work was being done. And so they took all these Greek texts and they were translating it into Arabic and spreading it throughout the Muslim world. Now, of course, it was pretty much mostly the Shiites, which are the weirdo offshoot branch of Islam that is, sort of the Persian, like Iran is a Shiite state now. Very different from the Sunni barbaric form of it. Not that there's really any good form of Islam, but the Shiites were kind of the less violent, bigger brain version. And that's what, most of the Arab alchemists were, probably many of them were kind of Persian. They were Sufi, they were Shiites, they were not quite as violent. You had to have a little bit of a bigger brain for this stuff. So the earliest sort of text from the Arabic world of alchemy was the Emerald Tablet, which kind of a big deal. It's only about a paragraph, like a couple paragraphs long, depending on how you want to format it. But it has been endlessly analyzed by people for ages to come. I mean, Isaac Newton was painstakingly trying to figure out what the hell this thing meant. Supposedly written by Hermes, and Hermetica, this sort of body of work that is associated with Hermes, it did contain some alchemical texts, but it wasn't really until the 10th century in the Islamic world that Hermes kind of became the father of alchemy. And as time went on, he sort of got retconned over and over to the point where he was like supposedly a native of Babylon. And some people even said that he was like a contemporary or a predecessor of Moses. They even like said that he prophesied the coming of Christ. By the 15th century, he was one of the most prominent prophets. He was even in the one of the murals at the Cathedral of Siena in Italy. So Hermes, a god, in the alchemical world. The Emerald Tablet, like I said, it was, analyzed greatly. It was probably written in the 8th century. It was written in like Arabic writing. I think it was like Syriac or something like that. It wasn't a European language. And it first appeared, as far as we know, in a work called The Book of Secret of Creation by Balinus, who he was a 9th century author. He was writing in Arabic. And according to him, he found it written on a tablet made of green stone, which was held by this long dead corpse in a sepulcher beneath the statue of Hermes Trismegistus, which means the thrice greatest. So, pretty deeply mysterious. The actual language of it is very mysterious. People wonder, like, oh, is this a recipe for the Philosopher's Stone? Which the Philosopher's Stone basically was like, I guess you could call it the Holy Grail of alchemy. It was this thing that could turn any metal to gold, and it could turn a lot of any metal into gold.
Yeah, that's like the it's the basis for the Sorcerer's Stone in the first Harry Potter, too. Mm-hmm. It's like the thing for immortality, like the elixir of immortality.
You brought up Harry Potter again.
Because, that's a Chinese thing. But,
yeah, I saw Eastern, you mentioned Eastern, they were more interested in immortality than...
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's confirmed. Harry Potter is Chinese.
Harry Potter is Chinese, and Dumbledore is the most famous alchemist of all time.
And he's gay.
Clearly, and yes, and Hermione's Blake. All right.
Yeah, so is Ron. Actually, he's just a soulless ginger, but I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's fairly short. I won't read the whole thing.
Sean
here.
Mosley, BTFO.
You can just Google it. It had some common themes that are anybody interested in the esoteric stuff will recognize themes like, that which is above is from that which is below, as above, so below. Mm-hmm. As all things were from one, its father is the sun and its mother the moon. The earth carried it in her belly, and the wind nourished it in her belly, as earth which shall become fire. Very mysterious stuff, but it contains a lot of sort of allusions and references to ideas that are very prevalent through pretty much all aspects of any kind of esoteric or occult secret knowledge. Like anybody that's interested in this stuff, you'll read this and it's you'll understand why it was so people were so obsessed with it, because it's just this perfect amount of vagueness and mysterious quality, while also referencing all these things that you can draw so many connections.
Leaves room for a lot of speculation.
Oh yeah, and was there a lot? So probably the big name in Arabic alchemy is Jabir ibn Hayyan, and I'll just call him Jabir. And kind of the tough thing about saying that he's like the biggest name in alchemy, which he was the biggest name, the problem is there's a lot of confusion over who this person really was, or if it was even a real person at all. Probably a pseudonym. There's stories that, he was born south of Baghdad in 720. He learned alchemy from Harbi the Himyarite, who apparently lived for 463 years. So take that with a grain of salt. And then he apparently learned from a fictional monk. Yeah. He apparently learned from a fictional monk named Morianos, who he'll come up later. And then some guy named Jafar, he probably just watched Aladdin, wrote that as a source in his books.
Yeah.
Definitely watched Aladdin.
But the thing is, like, what you got to understand about these, like, intellectual writers way, 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 way back in the day is that they didn't have the same idea of, like, sources and credit and this sort of thing. And pretty often these authors would write something and then attribute it to someone who already had some amount of prestige and authority in order to sort of give it some more oomph, get people to take it a little more seriously, to be like, hey, did you guys know that Aristotle wrote this? Like, oh, Plato wrote this. Like, like Plato did it with his dialogues of Socrates. Like, this guy wasn't writing down everything that happened in those. He was using Socrates to say the things that were Plato's ideas that were related to what Socrates taught, but were ultimately Plato's ideas, and then attributing it to him in order to get a little more gravitas. And it also allows these alchemists to maintain anonymity, or sort of a pseudonymity. And so there was a lot of works that were supposedly written by a guy named Jabir. It was probably written by a whole bunch of different people. It's probably a pseudonym. So why is he important? Well, he proposed the mercury-sulfur theory of metal, which persisted for centuries after him. And the idea is that, according to him, all metals are made from both some combination of mercury and sulfur. So it's got both of these ingredients in it in some proportion, and they combined deep underground, and that was where metals came from. Now, of course, one problem is, what did he mean by mercury and sulfur? This was a common issue in all alchemical texts, is like, what did he mean by this? Because that particular author might have a certain idea of what he meant. He might have said this, but really, like, if you talk to him in private, he'd be like, oh yeah, anybody who studied with me knows that when I'm talking about X, Y, or Z, what I really mean is A, B, or C, that sort of thing. And so he figured the idea was that if everything is made out of mercury and sulfur, then you could just change those proportions somehow, and it would change what it's made of. Right? I mean, that makes sense. You can follow that logic. And he kind of got that from Aristotle, probably. Because Aristotle, he said that there were two emanations that came from the center of the earth. One was dry and smoky, so sort of hot and dry. And the other was wet and steamy, like cold and wet. And these things combined to form everything else. So, Aristotle, this sort of wet, cold, hot, dry was a fundamental theory that he felt was underlying, the forms that all things take. And if you combine, like, say, hot and wet things, that's air. Hot and dry things, that's fire. Cold and wet makes water. Cold and dry makes earth. You see what I'm going for here?
Yeah.
So Jabir thought, if you can just change the proportion of hot to wet to dry to cold in whatever metal, that's going to change the metal.
You can change the properties of whatever you're dealing with.
Right, exactly.
By changing a couple of aspects about it.
Yeah, so what you just had to do was figure out, okay, you got a chunk of lead. Well, what are the proportions of these various ingredients, so to speak, in it? And how can I change what those proportions are by adding certain things to it?
Yeah, so to them, like, to an alchemist, like the periodic table of elements like we have now, dealing with, like, certain things, not just metals, but also gases and liquids and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
to an alchemist, this was sort of their periodic table, was like the heat, the dry, the wet, and the cold. Like they dealt with that. Each element, metal or whatever they were trying to change had its properties. They just needed to like change those, is what you're saying, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm glad you brought that up, because one thing that's really important is that all these alchemists, even up to the late 1600s, like very, 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 very late in alchemy's history, they were all working from the assumption that metals were compounds, that they were combinations of different things. And what we know now, of course, is that they're elements, and that they are, iron. An atom of iron is not made of oxygen and nitrogen and this other stuff. But these early alchemists, they didn't know that. And so all these things, all their theories were based on the idea that the metals were combinations of other things. Yeah, so, job here, like gold was probably made from the purest possible sulfur. And it mixed with, really pure mercury, and that's why gold is so pure and has such good properties.
Because it uses the purest of sulfur.
Yeah, and not only that are the ingredients pure, but the balance is perfect as well, which is why when it's created underground, it's so rare compared to these other metals, and why it has such better property. And I guess we should mention, up to the 18th century, there were really only 7 metals that were recognized. There was gold and silver, which were considered noble because of their very nice properties. They were resistant to corrosion. That was a big part of why it was considered noble. They had high melting points. They were pretty dense, easy to work with, this sort of thing. And the other 5 metals, and that was copper, tin, iron, lead, and mercury. So interesting that they knew mercury was a metal despite it being a liquid.
Interesting. Do you think that could have been just because of the color and the way that it shines and whatever?
I think that's probably what it was.
I feel like I've heard that before about mercury being considered a metal.
Yeah, it is a little weird. Like, I guess the problem would be trying to figure out what else would you call it, right? Maybe it was just sort of by process of elimination that they decided mercury was a metal.
Well, isn't it a metal that is liquid at your average room temperature?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What is it about mercury? Because I know that isn't it fairly dense or something? I'm not, I don't really know shit about this stuff.
It's really heavy.
Yeah, it's a super heavy liquid. So I mean,
but of course it's liquid at room temperature, whereas other stuff you really got to heat it up to get it to the liquid form. But even so, no,
it's a metal. Mercury is a metal.
Yeah,
it's just
is. I just think it's interesting that they knew that it was a metal. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as a metal, I mean, like I said, I'm pretty sure that had to do with the color and the fact that it's shiny like silver. I mean, it was literally called quicksilver for a very long time. The only thing is, it's just that it's liquid at room temperature. So.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's you're right. I think that's probably the clues they used. And so this idea, this sort of mercury sulfur theory, seemed at the time to be supported by other empirical observations. Like if you took iron or copper and you powdered it, and you grind it up into a powder and you throw it into a fire, it'll burn really brightly. Which they were like, oh, that must be the sulfur in it that's burning. It's got all these. Iron and copper must have a high sulfur concentration. And tin and lead, they melt really easily. And when you melt them, they look like mercury. So they're like, oh, this must have a really high mercury content. So that's where these ideas came from. Pretty neat, I think, that they were able to sort of...
they were able to know these things back then. This is fucking hundreds of years ago.
Thousands. Some of these you're talking this is it. I'm sorry, this was the Arabic, right?
Yeah, this is in the fucking. This was the Goddamn, what century was this? The 8th century?
Yeah, it was like 8th to 15th.
Yeah, the 8th century. This was back
So you're looking at
like from 900 AD.
Yeah. Yeah, you're looking
Holy
at
shit.
You're looking at what 1900 years
1100.
ago? Oh, 1100.
No, it's 1100.
1100. My
Yeah,
math
the
is messed
8th
up.
century. 8th century would be about 900 AD.
900 AD. Okay.
I think. I believe.
We're all messed up here. All right,
Yeah,
so
and
go ahead, Adam.
I just wanted to mention that it kind of an interesting quirk. So Jabir, of course, one of the problems if you're going for this like hot, wet, cold, dry theory is like you got to figure out what the proportions of things are. So how did he do that? He used this weird like alphabetical sort of analysis where he would take the name of something and he assigned like all the letters in the Arabic alphabet into this little chart that each letter was associated with a certain amount of these 4 main attributes. And then he would take the name of whatever it was and he would chart it out in this thing and then calculate its proportions based on how the word for this material lined up in this chart. And you might be thinking like, well, that's really dumb because like these words are totally arbitrary. Like why did this guy who had these other, like he was obviously a smart dude, or you know the people that were writing under his name were smart. They were making these fascinating empirical observations. Like why the hell would they think something like that? Well, what you got to know is that Muslims believe that Arabic is the language of God because according to Muhammad, the Quran was dictated to him by Gabriel the angel. It was dictated in Arabic to him. And so they believe that Arabic is this divine perfect language. So that's why he decided to do the alphabetical analysis that way. You know, according to him, like the idea he had was like, oh, well, why don't I just go to the divine perfect language to figure this stuff out? Just fun fact.
Yeah, it's interesting, dude.
It really is. But let's do this. Let's take. How close are we to the end of? I didn't get a chance to thumb through your notes, but how close are we to the end of the Arabic part of this?
I'm ready to move on to the sort of medieval Latin period.
All right, cool. Then if that's the case, we will take a break here at the end of the Arabic section of alchemy, the history of alchemy, and we'll listen to a little bit of music, and we're gonna come back. See you in a little bit.
Fuck yeah.
All right, everybody, we're back, and by we, I mean myself, Johnny Monoxide, and Adam Haidt. Larry Ridgeway had to bounce out on us, but I think we are going to be able to finish strong on this episode. It's good so far, man. You know a lot more about alchemy than I thought you did there, buddy.
I thought this was about Harry Potter.
Yeah, well, yeah, I did too. And that's what I did the research.
The good
on.
thing I just happened to have all these notes about alchemy lying around.
Right. It saved our ass, basically. But before we get started, this is still the Paranormies present the Ahnenerbe Hour, and me and Adam. So, guys, we're gonna do a couple of emails real quick. So, we got one. This is one of my favorite emails we've gotten in a while. It says, "Hey Johnny, great episode on the metabolic theory. I go on the keto diet when salty semen doesn't keep me pregnant." Can you guess who this is from?
Oh.
"To help heal from a super rare disease, idiopathic granulomatous mastitis. It persists like an autoimmune inflammatory disease, but because it's so incredibly rare, doctors don't understand the disease and just prescribe antibiotics, steroids, and opioids to manage the symptoms. I've only found full recovery after a strict keto diet. An amazing supplement that I take is called Instaketones, made by Julian Bakery. It's a little expensive, but I've never experienced anything like the ketogenic flu Scott was struggling with, and many others who eliminate carbs. It also helps with the salt issue as it contains a lot of sodium. It's 100% worth trying for anyone who wants to begin a keto diet or is currently on one. Also, thanks for the Titanic episode, a very entertaining conspiracy. The Salt Wife." That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
Salty.
Glad it was able to.
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Adam. You do your thing, and then I'll say.
I'm just saying, I'm glad you liked the Titanic one. That one was really, really cool to research. I don't know, something about that one was just fun.
Yeah. More and more people that listen to it have messaged me and said stuff like, "Yeah, dude, I see. Oh, the Titanic conspiracy. Oh man, Johnny and the guys are just shit posting." And by the end of the episode, you're like, "God damn it, the Titanic didn't sink. It was the Olympic." And what I find amusing is that we've had Salty on the show. We did Passport to Magonia, Jacques Vallée with Salty, and his wife started listening to the Paranormies, and she loves the show. And I'll give her a little shout out, a little Salty's wife. Thanks for listening. And Salty said we could have done a better nautical conspiracy. But I don't know. I don't know that you can find a better conspiracy as to the crux of every bad thing that's happened in the 20th century gets pinned to the Titanic sinking.
We should have known the Titanic was bullshit, though, because that Hollywood movie, when Jews are getting their hands that deep into it, something in there was a lie.
Well, the more we went into the research, the more I realized, yep, that's the movie. It's like the same thing with Pearl Harbor. Whenever they make a huge blockbuster movie out of something, for a fact their Jews are hiding something. That's pretty crazy. But we got one or two more emails I'll get you to read here. Did I do this one already? Hey fellas, been listening for about a month and a half now and have finished almost every episode. Loved every second and eager to hear more. I came on the train right after you took the Sandy Hoax video down. Now, see, here's where you're wrong, buddy. We didn't take it down. I was wondering if you had a mirror up or if I could get a copy of the audio file. Really appreciate your work and can't wait for more stuff on Missing 411. From Potad Scumbiglia. Also known as King John Un for life. Great email address there, buddy. I am now in a place where I have high-speed internet and I can upload all the back episodes, the stuff that got showed from SoundCloud, and I will be doing that on days off coming up soon. So all of our back episodes will be up. They are on YouTube, except for have we reloaded the Sandy Hook episode, Adam? I'm not sure if we have.
We shouldn't.
Just leave it. All right.
I think we probably shouldn't, because we have it, we can upload it in other places that won't show it and then put a ding on our account.
All right. So in the spirit of not getting shut down on YouTube and having our many thousands of fans hate us for losing our channel, we're not going to do that. But we'll get it up where you can listen to it there, Goy. Even if we get it back on the Zencast. I don't think Zencast really cares. SoundCloud's pretty SJW-y. We got an email asking about the Twitter being shut down. We got shut down after the Jews Ruin Everything Part 1. Here's another one on the metabolic theory of cancer. Hello. Just wanted to thank you guys for doing an episode on the metabolic syndrome. I'm not going to dox myself, but I am trained and work in molecular cellular biology and do some nutritional counseling, and was impressed by how you guys pretty much nailed it. The next health red pill you might want to look into is the electrical and magnetic aspects to life. A good place to start is The Body Electric by Dr. Robert Becker and some writings of Dr. Jack Kruse, even though he can be a little nutty. Have you met us? If you have any questions, let me know and keep it up. Stuff like the last episode has to be more widespread. Thanks, man. Yeah, definitely. That episode. We got mixed reviews in the comments because there were some people who were like, that's not anything to do with the paranormal, the supernatural, or even conspiratorial. Now, here's where you're wrong, kiddo. What is a bigger conspiracy than something like your diet, which is put together by, the FDA, and the food pyramid is definitely, put together by Jews, which cancer kills 1,500 people a day. You're telling me that's not a conspiracy? If anything, it's one of the largest conspiracies in the history of the world. It's killed millions, more than more than any genocide, like the Holodomor or the Armenian genocide. I'm pretty sure. We're not talking about like fake genocides like the Holocaust, but
definitely, yes, killed more people than the Holocaust.
Yes, cancer has killed more people than the Holocaust times probably 6 million. But yeah, we don't have to do every show doesn't have to be about ghosts, guys. But we're working on that. We're gonna end up, like I said before, we've got the new series coming out. We're gonna have a couple of episodes of stuff coming out probably every week. So keep tuning in to the Paranormies, and you will get more content. And don't forget, you can support your local Paranormie by donating to the Paranormies at paranormiespresent@gmail.com, and our Patreon is Johnny Monoxide is creating Paranormies Present, the Ahnenerbe Hour, if the Patreon ever gets back running to where they can process credit cards again. And you can Venmo us if you want. It's it's at Paranormies. It's Paranormies Present. So, if you like our stuff and you want to support us and you want us to keep doing this stuff and making more of it, hook a brother up. Hook a bunch of brothers up, actually. There's several of us. So, all right. So we're talking about alchemy. We've gone through the greco-egyptian ancient alchemy. We have gone through the Arabic series of alchemy, and Jabir ibn Hayyan, that guy, Jobber, as Adam was calling him.
The Jobber.
The Jobber. And now we're going to get into a little bit more modern. We're going to get into the medieval Latin alchemy, which is where it really took off in Europe, and it became like a big thing. So yeah, you want to go ahead, Adam?
Yeah, the medieval Latin alchemy is this one's kind of fun because the sort of origin story of it is pretty precisely nailed down. As we are told, that apparently alchemy arrived in Latin Europe. It was a Friday. It was the 11th of February in 1144. And that was the day that Robert of Chester, who was an English monk, he was working in Spain at the time, he completed his translation of a book that was written in Arabic that he called, in English, it would be On the Composition of Alchemy. And in the prologue to it, he explained that he decided to translate an alchemical text because our Latin world does not yet know what alchemy is and what its composition is. So I think that's a fun little tidbit that, you can sort of nail down the exact day that alchemy arrived in the sort of Latin medieval period in Europe. And now this was a big deal, just generally speaking, this time period in Europe. There was, it was kind of called the Renaissance of the 12th century. There was Gothic cathedrals being built. There was all sorts of legal reforms. There's agricultural revolutions. And so you were, more and more wealth was being generated. And so more sort of wondrous things that were not specifically dedicated to survival and subsistence were being able to sort of rise up and take more, and be more present in life. The West that was finally fighting back against Islam, they started to organize armies and crusades to go take back what is, rightfully ours. And at this time, all sorts of, as they were, pushing Islam back, they were able to get their hands on all sorts of these alchemical texts that were, previously just a bunch of Arab Muslims were hanging out with them, and now they were in the hands of Europeans. And that's, to the surprise of nobody listening, was when alchemy really started to take off. And now, of course, literacy wasn't as widespread back then. So the monks that were bringing all these books back, they were mostly concerned with these literary texts, things that were about theory and this sort of thing. Not as many sort of manuals, but there was one that was very popular. It was sort of compiled by the monk Theophilus in 1125. It was called On Diverse Arts. And this was a manual for pigments, for making glass, for making cast metal objects, this sort of thing. That it was different from these literary things because it was in such careful technical detail. Like whoever compiled it, like Theophilus, was familiar with these techniques, and so it was written well enough and in enough detail that you could take a copy of On Diverse Arts in English today, and you could probably reproduce pretty much anything out of it, as long as you knew, what it was referring to. Like here's a really interesting recipe from it, and it was a recipe for something called Spanish gold. The ingredients list here was some red copper, some human blood, some vinegar, and this one might be kind of difficult to find. Probably can't pick it up at Trader Joe's. Basilisk powder.
What exactly is basilisk powder?
Harry Potter. It's from Harry Potter. No, I'm kidding. So the European monks they didn't really mess with anything like that, but apparently the Arabic alchemists were pretty familiar with that. So if you want to make a basilisk, which is this sort of snake-like lizard creature that can kill just from looking at something, it can kill it. So in order to make it, pretty simple. What you do is you take 2 old roosters and you put them in a narrow place, like a small enclosed cage, something like that. And you just overfeed them. You fatten them up really, really fat. Eventually, they're going to copulate and make some eggs. So then you take those rooster eggs and you give those eggs to some toads.
Hang on a second. Did you say you put 2 roosters and feed them, and then they copulate and make eggs?
Yeah, the Arabs were very familiar with copulating with, various animals. They knew how to do this sort of thing.
Right, but how would the roosters copulating with each other and making eggs?
Well, I don't know. That's the thing. The European monks knew the recipes. They didn't really mess with that kind of thing, though. But anyway, so you give those eggs to some toads, and the toads will sort of, hatch them into these chicks that they'll grow serpent tails, and then they'll mature into basilisks. Okay, so no, basilisks are pretty dangerous. So you got to put them in a kettle, and you bury that kettle under the ground, and you wait for them to mature in the kettles. And then after they're sort of matured, you got grown-up adult basilisks. You dig them back up. Then you incinerate them, and you mix their ashes. That's the basilisk powder. You mix those ashes with the blood and the vinegar. You put that on some copper. You heat it up, and it'll turn the copper to gold.
Interesting.
Maybe you couldn't reproduce that one today, but the rest of On Diverse Arts. Really good technical manual.
Mm-hmm.
So, because most of this, these alchemical works came from the Arab world, this habit of various writers sort of using the pseudonym of a bigger name, so to speak, continued, and so sort of Latinized versions of people like Jobber were used for the authorship, so to speak, of these texts. So they changed the name of it. They wrote it in a Latin way. There was one guy who used the name Jobber, and it was pronounced like Jebber. He was probably an Italian Franciscan friar. He was named Paul of Taranto, and he used the name Jebber, but people were able to figure out who he was based on comparing these, texts by so-called Jebber to texts by Paul, and they're like, oh, probably the same guy. And what he did was he created this book called Theory and Practice. And now what was a big deal about Theory and Practice? It classified materials in the same way as Jabir and like Abu Bakr and these other, Arabic alchemists. But he classified them by like actual observable properties, not by just, ideas that they had. And Theory and Practice was this, compilation of, well, just that, theory and practice. He did a lot of practical testing of everything he did in order to inform his theories. And then as he would inform his theories, that would lead to new ideas for new experiments, that sort of thing. And so it was this feedback loop of, he was doing science. He was basically a scientist at this point. He also published a work called Summa Perfectionis, which is, at the time, it was his comprehensive textbook on alchemy. And so he starts it out by opening up with this, like, sort of a dialogue where he's explaining all the arguments for chrysopoeia, that is gold making, arguments for it being a legitimate art. He would present common arguments against it. And at the end, he would sort of explain what he thought was a better argument. And he just so happened to decide that, yes, gold making is probably possible. So then in the rest of the text, he's summarizing the knowledge that was sort of known at that point about various metals, how to purify them, how to work with them. And then he would sort of talk about practical techniques, the apparatus. He would talk about the properties of the metal, the different grades of the transmuting agents. I mean, this was a textbook. This was a scientific textbook that, never would have come into being if people weren't trying to make gold. Yeah, he had sort of 3 different grades of transmutagens. There was like level 1, which really only changed the superficial appearance, which that recipe I explained earlier, of changing silver to gold, so to speak, by just changing the color of it with this like chemical reaction. You could consider that like a level 1 reagent. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that wasn't like, that's not magic. That was just some chemical reaction that changed the surface of whatever it was, and the product of this reaction happened to look like gold. And so then there's like kind of the level 2, which for whatever reason wasn't explained in the book I read. But level 3, these, the highest, the best form of a reagent for your transmutations could really actually not just change the appearance, but really change the metal into gold or silver.
That would be like literal transmutation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he had this sort of coherent, he had an actual matter theory that was, it was based on the mercury sulfur theory and this idea that Aristotle had called minima naturalia, which is like the smallest natural thing. And it was this sort of like pore theory where all solid substances had these small pores in them
Right.
that had, which is what gave them the different properties. And it's really fascinating because he said, okay, well, gold is so dense because the way that the mercury and the sulfur in it is arranged, or so the mercury and the sulfur particles are the smallest ones you could possibly make, and they're packed a lot tighter than something like tin, which is lighter than gold is. And he explained like a lead oxide powder as the lead, like the pores in it, they're all different sizes. The particles in it are bigger. They're not put together very well, and so it can break apart. And that's why only these baser metals can be sublimated or turned into these powders where they're not very reactive, because they're just low quality stuff. Like what they're made of is low quality. And I mean, he's approaching like atomic theory with this. So it's just absolutely fascinating that before you even had like just good microscopes generally, they were coming up with these ideas that, trying to look at these properties and think, how can we explain this in a way that's consistent with other knowledge that we have? These people were scientists. I know I've been saying that a lot, but without alchemy, we would not have modern science.
Right. It is the precursor, the grandfather, whatever you want to call it, of actual chemistry. I don't think we would still have, we would have science. We just wouldn't have chemistry. I mean, because biology is a
that's a good
science
point.
and astronomy is a science. We wouldn't have chemistry. This is the precursor to chemistry, where you can take, something and change it into something else chemically, which is basically what they were doing. And, they just thought there was more esoteric and occult stuff behind it.
Right. They didn't understand. They knew what they were doing was doing something. They just didn't know exactly what it was. And so through all this experimentation, they were, trying out theories, eliminating the ones that didn't work. It was really cool stuff. Like backbreaking labor, like the amount of time and effort put into it is really astounding. It's inspiring, really. So up until about 1200 AD, alchemy was pretty open. Like people were open about alchemy. People would know about alchemy. It wasn't really a big deal. People just treated it as, a sort of craft, a trade, that sort of thing. It wasn't really controversial. Well, in 1200, Alfred of Sarashal, he translated, so there was one of the Arabic alchemists, he wasn't an alchemist, so to speak. His name was Ibn Sina. Back in the sort of Arabic period of alchemy, he published a denunciation of it, because over in the Islamic world, actually, a lot of people thought that alchemists were frauds. It was, totally fraudulent people. Now, this is a Semitic, region. Probably a lot of people got ripped off by Jewish alchemists. That's
a lot of times. That is your headcanon, but I do know of stories in the Middle East where an alchemist would go to a town and teach people, and basically like a traveling salesman, like a traveling alchemist, would teach people how to transmutate lead into gold or into silver or whatever, and he would give them the formula, the recipe, whatever, and then he would leave and he would come back and he's like, listen, I forgot the most important part. Is that while you're doing this, you cannot think of snakes. And then they would always, somebody would think of snakes while they were doing it and they would mess it up. They're like, that was the reason why it would never work, is because somebody was obviously thinking of snakes or whatever it was, and this story is actually,
Jewish.
Well, actually, it actually comes from the first version I heard of this story, and there's like 2 or 3 different versions. Was we weren't really going to talk about it. Was out of India, and the traveling Indian alchemist said basically the same thing. It's like, this is the formula, but make sure you're not thinking of monkeys. And there you go. And like the first recorded version of that, apparently a monkey showed up while they were trying to transmutate something into gold or whatever they were doing, and like the monkey ruined it, and they were like, the alchemist's curse is true, no monkeys allowed or whatever. Yeah, so there's I think about it like that kind of a scam, man. Like, you're like, look, you'll be able to make, now here, give me your gold, Now you're going to be able to make plenty more, but I'm going to need this gold because you're paying me. Now you'll be able to make plenty more gold. Just make sure you don't think about snakes while you're doing it. And of course, the first thing you're going to think about is snakes. You know, it's like, it's the same. It's the same thing. It's like, what was it? The movie Ghostbusters? You know, don't think about anything. Blank your mind out. And of course, the very first thing he thinks of is like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. And that's what shows up. So.
Yeah. Anyway,
but yeah, sorry to get off track. That was actually just a cute little anecdote, I thought.
Yeah. So Ibn Sina, he wrote this this denunciation. He's like, alchemy is a big fraud. He said specifically that art can never match nature, and he claimed that even if you did think you transmuted something, like even if you think you turned lead into gold, it's not the way that nature did it, and it's going to be fake. It's not genuine. Doesn't matter if it passes all the gold tests. That's not real gold. And along with this denunciation, he had a diss minerals. So Alfred of Seneschal, he was translating this, and he thought, okay, well, I'm publishing Aristotle's work called Meteors, which was also about minerals. And so he's like, oh, it'll be good. I might as well include this. I got this here. Well, wouldn't you know it? A copyist who must have been running late to work that morning wasn't very careful and didn't distinguish them from the part of the book that was written by Aristotle. And so when it went out and people received it, they thought that it was Aristotle saying this stuff like, oh, transmutation is impossible. You can't do it. It's all fake, right? So it was just this confusion. And that is part of how alchemy started to become a little bit controversial in the medieval Latin period. Now, pretty quickly, refutations of this started coming out, trying to be like, you know, the alchemists trying to do some damage control here, saying, one book, it was called the Book of Hermes, explained, used rational analysis and experience to explain how alchemists could make salts that are exactly like natural salt, and they probably could. I mean, it's not that hard to do. To try and, refute this, confusion about people thinking that Aristotle was denouncing transmutation. And Saint Albert the Great, he lived in, he was born in 1200, died 1280. He also refuted this idea by Ibn Sina. But his student, Thomas Aquinas, actually agreed, and he thought that alchemists could only really alter the appearance. But he had a caveat. He said, however, if the alchemist could make gold in the same process that nature made it, then it would be real gold. But of course, now the question is, well, how did nature make it? And they were probably not familiar with nuclear science at the time, so it was kind of a little, caveat that doesn't actually...
Are you saying you believe that the gold and stuff is manufactured inside the Earth by nuclear reactions? It's not sent here from outer space.
I'm referring to, technically speaking, you could do ways of like nuclear elemental decay to turn one element into another, but it would be a complete waste of time and money.
The amount of energy and the expenditure of energy that you would need and finances it wouldn't be worth it to recoup a little bit.
Yeah,
it's not like crypto mining.
Yeah, but there was some people were coming out like Giles, another one of the followers of Saint Albert the Great. He was worried that alchemical products, which was not just transmutation. Like, don't forget, alchemists were making all sorts of different stuff. They were basically chemists with a little bit different goal than modern chemistry has. And Giles, he was worried that, you wouldn't really know if something they made was harmful. He was kind of concerned trolling alchemists, like, oh, how do you know that harmful unknown properties? Like, what if someone gets hurt? And in fact, one Roger Bacon, a friar, he made such a strong defense of alchemy. He claimed that human alchemy was more powerful than nature.
Whoa!
So it's yeah, that one's a little bit farther than I would take it.
Yeah.
But then again, I mean, if alchemists believed that they were just doing natural processes, then alchemy would have to at least be as strong, like at least as powerful as nature.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so there was a lot of back and forth going on through the ages, and Pope John the 22nd decided that he was going to just settle it in the ring. He convened a debate in 1317 to decide the matter. Basically, he got all the top alchemists and all the top detractors to come together, and they were going to hash it out and decide, once and for all whether alchemy was fraudulent or not. Well, sad to say, alchemists got blown the fuck out completely. They were smeared as frauds and charlatans. People came out saying that they were just trying to counterfeit gold. They were just trying to counterfeit money. Like, these guys are just a bunch of con artists.
Now, do we think that was just do we think that was just the church, trying to exert its power over everything, and actually smearing something that was technically true?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with controlling the money supply. I mean, the kings of England and France and even the Republic of Venice, they banned transmutational alchemy because that's the thing. They didn't say that alchemy was like not possible. They didn't say transmutation was not possible. They just were a bunch of frauds trying to like debase the currency supply and like mess with the money supply. They were saying that they were frauds, not that it wasn't a
well, didn't he also try to tie it in? Didn't he also try to tie in alchemy to witchcraft? Because I know he was a big anti-witchcraft pope. He had a few. I guess he was a victim of an assassination attempt. Somebody tried to poison him and kill him via sorcery. So he basically went after witchcraft. And I thought that tied into the alchemy thing. I might be wrong, but I know he did that.
That's a possibility. Yeah. I think they were ready to use anything it took to get this whole alchemy thing out of business because they were really. I think they had to have thought that they had to have been worried that transmutation was possible because that would limit their control of the money supply. And it would limit the power of these monarchs in the Republic of Venice and stuff. And so
he said that basically it wasn't the learning of this stuff that was bad. It was the actual performing of it. So I guess that he could the transmutation in alchemy would be technically performing magic to those guys. So it's possible, and you can tie that into not that they're just frauds, but they're actually performing magic as well.
Yeah. That's I hadn't heard about that. That wasn't part of what I read. But anyway, so all these laws making transmutation illegal came out. But of course, if you're a king, the idea that you could just make gold, I mean, that's pretty tempting. You're already pretty powerful. You want to do, you control. You got all this gold supply you're trying to control as it is. Like, if you could just have a little bit more control over it, that sounds pretty nice. So in a very English fashion, Henry IV in 1404, he issued a statute, or he took the previous statute and he modified it. And he said, okay, well, you can get a license. You'll have to come to the court and we can license you to transmute metals into gold. But you can only sell the gold to the treasury and the royal mint. So, alchemy wasn't dead. This was not, game over for alchemy because it's just too good. Like the thought of being able to make gold was just too much. They couldn't keep that down. Now, the alchemists themselves also didn't care about these laws. They continued doing what they were doing. And they just ramped up their methods of developing secrecy. And they also started to make started creating links between Christianity and Christian theology and alchemy. in a sort of, I think, in a attempt to legitimize it. One of the big names at this time was John of Rupasissa, and he was born in central France, 1310. He became a Franciscan friar, and he was a really hardcore friar. He was a member of the Spirituals, which was this sect of these Franciscan friars that were totally apocalyptic. They thought the end times were right around the corner, like the Antichrist was going to show up at any moment. He was so radical that he was actually arrested in 1344, and he spent most of the rest of his life in prison. And that's where he wrote his books. And he published in 1350 a book called The Book of Light. And in it, he explains that he is interested in alchemy because he really wanted to help the church in the coming like trials and tribulations. Like to him, he wanted to be able to make all sorts of, important resources, not as a matter of greed, but because he thought that, the most serious trials of mankind were about to begin, and he wanted to have everything that he could. And he was also interested in developing medicines from alchemy. And this is where you start to see alchemy become a sort of a two-pronged art, where there's one branch of it trying to create gold and the other branch of it trying to create medicines. And so this is where pharmacy sort of comes from. So chemistry and pharmacy, which are of course intimately related, both are evolved out of the milieu of alchemy. And he had the idea that the Philosopher's Stone would also basically be a panacea. It was this, sort of essence of gold. And of course, gold, they believe, was just like perfect thing. So if you could figure out how to, take the properties out of gold or like replicate it or something, that you could turn that into a medicine as well. And he also shared the mercury sulfur theory. So this is really carried on through, and probably just because of the interesting properties of mercury and sulfur and the sort of opposing, this complementary sort of sulfur being the hot, dry, sort of masculine element, and mercury being the cold, wet, feminine element. Bringing those things together in a sort of a reproductive allegory is very common. So yeah, one other cool thing is John, he recognized like mass balance, where the mass at the beginning of the reaction has to be the same at the end of the reaction, because matter is neither created nor destroyed. Now, he didn't really have the modern axioms for that, but he knew that that was the case, because he could take an experiment, and he would put in some amount of mercury, and then he would sublimate it with some other chemical, and it would leave behind a sediment. But then he would weigh it, and it would end up being the same amount, because whatever it was reacting with was being added to the mercury. So even though the mercury, like the end product, it seemed to be smaller, and it seemed to leave behind some stuff, the total weight of everything at the end was the same. So pretty cool stuff. Let's see. All right. What time are we at?
We're at
39 minutes?
About 40 minutes, yeah.
Okay, you know what? Let's make sure I'm able to cover... Oh, okay. No, this one's important too. All right. So he also wrote this book called On the Consideration of the Fifth Essence. Now...
hold on. Consideration of the what?
On the consideration of the fifth essence of all things.
The fifth essence, okay.
Yeah. And this is where he said that alchemy was going to be helpful to health and pharmaceuticals, that sort of thing. So what he wanted was something to prevent like aging and to heal corruption, wounds, that sort of thing. And he distilled some wine, and basically he was distilling alcohol and he thought that this was this like magical, incorruptible fifth essence of things, and that's where quintessential like the Latin is quinta essentia, quintessential, the sort of most fundamental part of something, right? So this fun little bit of etymology there. And he thought that there was something special about wine, and it was this fifth essence that he called alcohol, that or the alcohol is what he called this fifth essence, because he noticed that like wine doesn't go bad. It doesn't, like, you leave, you know, like a jug of wine out, it's not going to go bad. You leave like a piece of meat out, it's going to get rotten and start to decay and this sort of thing.
Right.
And you can even preserve stuff by, like, if you drop some meat into some like distilled alcohol, it's never going to go bad.
Mm-hmm.
And he didn't really understand what it was, but he thought that it was going to be essential at some point to, you know, medicine and health and this sort of thing. And he would use, it was called the water of life, like aqua vitae, or there's a couple other words for it, but it basically just means distilled spirits. And this etymology goes, you know, way, way back. So he would take that and he would use that to like soak herbs to get, you know, this sort of essence of these healing herbs out of it. And that actually is, you know, most of the chemicals that, like, most medicines are derived from plants anyway. So they take whatever chemicals are in the plants, they process them to make the medicine. And a lot of times you can just use the plant itself, like whatever chemical in there is good enough. Well, most of these are organic compounds, which are a lot more soluble in alcohol than they are in water. And so he was really doing, you know, pretty stuff that's like routine organic chemistry now, just these organic extractions from stuff. You know, way back in like the 1300s. So he sort of stumbled upon this and experimented with it and realized, like, hey, this is really effective. Pretty neat stuff. Now let's see. We can skip.
So when are we going to get into? When are we? I was saying, when are we going to get into the? Where are we at right now? What year is it now?
So this is still the 12th to 15th centuries.
Okay.
Let me see here. Hold on. I have my freaking notes. Yeah. Okay. We're almost at the golden age. Don't worry. I just want to mention that a lot of these alchemists were using alchemy to sort of like connect it with the Christian theological what's the word? You know, these ideas as a way of sort of saving face, I think, and to try and legitimize it. Like Petrus Bonus of Ferrara, he thought that Christian doctrine would be proven by alchemy. He wrote this book called The New Pearl of Great Price, and he claimed that pagan philosophers predicted the coming of Christ by creating the Philosopher's Stone. So this guy who was called Arnauld of Villanova, who was actually a physician, but an alchemist used his name, and this alchemist claimed that the purification of mercury was comparable to the life of Christ, where just as Christ suffered 4 things: scourging, a crown of thorns, crucifixion, thirst. So you have to, you know, in the same way, you have to basically torture, so to speak, the mercury in order to purify it. And just as Christ was glorified, so would the mercury be glorified in the process of becoming the Philosopher's Stone. And just as, you know, Christ brings healing, salvation, so does the Philosopher's Stone sort of redeem these base metals and turn them into gold, into this perfect form. Okay. Now we can start to get into the golden age, the cool part.
The golden age, and this is the time, the 1500s through about the late 1700s when alchemy became really popular with a lot of people. You have, of course, we're going to talk about Paracelsus. We're going to talk about Sir Isaac Newton. We're going to talk about Voltaire a little bit, maybe. We'll talk about Sir John Dee, Benjamin Franklin. So you want to talk about these people that are alchemists. There are legends that we have had early presidents of the United States of America that were alchemists.
I would definitely believe that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They were interested in all sorts of occult, esoteric things.
Oh yeah, witchcraft was a no-no, but the occult was like the game of the landed gentry,
Yeah, well, like we always say, even if you don't believe this stuff, the most powerful people in the world do.
Mm-hmm. And they have for a very, very long time. We have alchemists who hunted witches back in the day. Cotton Mather was an alchemist. He was one of the guys. We talked about him with Patty Tarleton when we talked about the not the Blair Witch. Jesus Christ. Oh, good Lord. And that's just stuck in my head now. What do you call it? Witches. Good Lord. Why can't I think of it now? It's just a massive brain fart.
Well, anyway.
Salem witch trials. I'm sorry. The Salem witch trials. Good Lord.
Oh,
John.
That's what you meant.
Yeah, Cotton Mather. He hunted witches in back in the day. He was very against astrology, and yet he knew how to cast an astrological chart. But anyways, yeah, he was. We have all these people back.
Now that's interesting, because the alchemists oftentimes associated each of the metals with the planets.
That's
now,
true.
The sun and the moon were considered planets. So gold was representing the sun, right. Silver the moon, copper was Venus, iron was Mars.
Iron's
tin
red,
was
therefore
Jupiter.
Mars. Now, see, tin being Jupiter, that's an interesting one to me. Maybe it's because it is always kind of a bright white, but I don't know. Hey,
lead was Saturn.
Yep. And let me guess.
Go ahead.
Was Mercury Mercury?
Yes. Yeah, good guess. Wow. Have you been doing your Googles?
I actually didn't do my Googles, but I read your notes. So
it's just a guess. Oh, okay. Well, anyway. So yeah. And a lot of times in their text, they would just refer to those things interchangeably. Like they might say, oh, add, 1 dram of Venus. And you just got to know that that's copper. Right. Assuming they're actually talking about copper and not coded.
Well, right, because they did a lot of finagling with the words and changing the meanings and stuff. So there's a lot of codified type stuff. So Venus might not necessarily always mean copper, depending on who's saying it to whom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so they were still using the transmutation. They were still trying to make gold, and like I said, there was the Chrysopoean, the gold making branch, and the pharmaceutical branch, and they thought that transmutation theory was reasonable because they thought that it was natural. Because when you mine lead ore, a lot of times it has little bits of silver in it. When you're mining silver, a lot of times it'll have little bits of gold. And so the idea was that these transmutation processes, they were already taking place underground. Like everything that they were trying to do was already happening naturally. They were just trying to figure out how to do it faster and in a lab, whenever they want. Yeah. There's also some one of the things I thought was really interesting from the Golden Age were these odd anomalous metals that were recorded, where some alchemists, they were trying to extract the tincture of gold, extract the properties of gold out of it and just leave behind plain white hunk of metal. Like they were trying to pull out the gold part of gold and just leave behind like this dull uncolored metal. And there was a Flemish guy named Johann Baptista von Helmont, and this was in the 1600s, early 1600s, who he claimed that he extracted some kind of green oil from copper, and there was like white copper left over. He thought he had extracted this sulfur from it. But if that was the case, then shouldn't the mercury and the mercury sulfur theory be left behind? And so he's like, oh, well, I must have just extracted the exterior sulfur, not the interior, the fundamental. So just kind of odd.
Interesting.
I have no idea if that's true. Guy George Starkey in the about the same period in the 1650s, he claimed to produce something he called luna fixa, which was silver in appearance, but had all the properties of gold, like the melting point, the density, resistance to corrosion, that kind of thing. He even had some goldsmiths test it out, and it passed the test, and they bought it for like 8 times the price of silver at the time. And so people are thinking like, well, maybe was it like platinum or something? It's this odd story. Like who... like what was it? Like if this was
I have
true,
no idea what that was. Yeah, if you can create white gold. Now, what exactly is white gold now? I know it's like it's gold, but like what are the properties of white gold that make it actually white?
Oh, it's just an alloy of like gold and some other.
Okay,
metal.
so it's not actually gold. Kind of like white chocolate's not actually chocolate.
Well, there's gold in it. It's just not pure.
Yeah. Okay. So who knows that if he made platinum or if he just fused some sort of alloy together to create what we actually call white gold.
Yeah, it's hard to say because it passed the goldsmith test. So now you mentioned Paracelsus. Did you want to talk about him?
Yeah. I mean, he was an alchemist who was a Gnostic. He was around the early 1500s. You know, he was born in 1493-ish. He was a Swiss physician. You know, he was an astrologer, and he's part of the German Renaissance. He was born in Egg, by the way, in Egg, Switzerland. Yeah, I found that
nice name.
Yeah, right. He basically was a military surgeon, and he worked traveling around with the Venetian army. But at one point he bought the rights of citizenship in Strasbourg to establish his own practice. So he was settling down in Strasbourg. He was then called to Basel, to the sickbed of a printer named Johann Frobenius, who he reportedly cured him by using medicine that he had basically extracted himself. You know, he transmutated whatever it was into the medicine that he used. He was an innovator in medicine. He basically invented pharmacology.
Yeah, he was very, very like loudly critical of modern what was medicine at the time. He thought it was all just a bunch of rubbish, and that he had some really fascinating ideas where he believed that you could take like some substance and you could distill it and separate it into its constituent parts, remove the parts you don't want, and then just reconstitute it. And so he believed that you could do this with anything. And so you could even take poisons and make medicines out of them by distilling it, separating it out the parts you don't want, reconstituting it into this more concentrated form, and then apply that to whatever, medical, whatever ailment you're trying to heal, which is like, that's just a modern chemical procedure. Like that's just a simple thing. I've done that many times.
Back then you were not just a surgeon, you were also a barber. These people back then. He basically, well, like you said, he criticized the modern medicine of the time, and for that he was compared to Martin Luther, which I find really funny. Just basically because of his defiance, because Martin Luther, went against the church, and he went against modern medicine. Here's a quote saying, "I leave it to Luther to defend what he says, and I will be responsible for what I say. That which you wish to Luther, you wish also to me. You wish us both in the fire." Interesting. Yeah, he had to leave Basel after he was threatened with an unwinnable lawsuit. So somebody was trying to sue him basically for everything he had, and he took off and to Alsace in 1528, and basically took up the career of a physician again. And now his name's Paracelsus, but his actual name was Theophrastus von Hohenheim. His name was his full name, Philippus Aurelius Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim. That's a long name.
Long name. I think it's some people think that the word bombastic comes from him. I'm not sure if that's true, but he certainly had a bombastic personality, regardless of where that word came from.
Interesting. But that's when he took up the name Paracelsus. So it's his pseudonym.
Okay, yeah, a very common thing in alchemy.
To take up a pseudonym. He wrote, or actually, I don't know if he wrote it, but there was a publication called Practica in Nuremberg, and they supposed that the name was intended for the use as non-medical works, while his real name was used for his medical publications. I don't know if that's true or not, but they call him Dr. Paracelsus in 1536. He wrote the Grosse Wundernetze. So his name is usually a Latinization of Hohenheim, which is Celsius, high or tall, and of course surpassing Celsius. And that he didn't invent the name himself. So
it was given to him.
It was given to him. It's one of those things where you don't ever give yourself a nickname, because that's not really how it works. Yeah, somebody has to give you the nickname for it to stick. He worked in medical philosophy. He worked on miners' diseases. He worked on religious programs. He worked with he worked in a place called Pfaffer's Abbey. And he wrote about their baths, which were apparently some sort of therapeutic bathing facility. He wrote a thing called Astronomia Magna, also known as Philosophia Sagax, in 1537, but it was published in 1571, and it covers demonology, divination, theology, astrology, hermeticism, and basically laid out the basis of his fame later on as a prophet. That had a motto. There's the motto, Alterius non sit qui sus est potest. Let no man belong to another who can belong to himself. That is his quote, inscribed on his portrait in 1538. The man, he started, but was basically Paracelsianism, which, was basically, a movement of people who were trying to subvert the traditional Galenic physics. And, he used his therapies, his occult medicine, basically. He was like an occult physician.
Yeah, I see.
Him being in in the 16th century, there was a natural affinity for him to work within the Hermetic, Pythagorean, and Neoplatonic philosophies that were so central to the Renaissance, really. He basically rejected...
A lot of these Greek ideas back.
I'm sorry?
A lot of these Greek ideas really stuck around.
Mm-hmm. He kind of rejected the magic theories of people like Nicholas Flamel and Heinrich Agrippa. There's a book called Orthodoxies of Magic Astrology, and he was very much into astrology, which is interesting because we just said that Cotton Mather was an astrologer as well.
Yeah, I guess they didn't really view it as magic.
Yeah. Well, astrology really isn't. It's not magic. You're just, using the stars in the universe, right?
Yeah, and trying to make predictions and explain things with them.
Right. He basically he rejected all the philosophies of Aristotle, more or less. So, which is interesting. But he did accept the concept of water, air, fire, and earth, but he saw them as more of a foundation for other stuff, for other properties that you can build on, as opposed to them being the be all end all there. So,
do you want to finish up? I have like a philosopher's stone recipe.
Yeah, let's do this. Let's do this, yeah, because we've been getting into this. There's so much more to alchemy. We can go 4 hours on this. We can still go 4 hours, not just the number 4, but like the word 4 hours. Let Adam tell us about this Philosopher's Stone recipe. And we'll get into more of this at another time, because like we barely scratched the surface of alchemy, really. We haven't talked about...
Yeah.
We haven't talked about Tolkien. We haven't talked about...
we haven't even talked about the psychical sort of like... Because everything that I've been talking about is alchemists thinking that they're doing perfectly natural, what is effectively a science.
Mm-hmm.
And there's whole schools of, esoteric sort of...
Oh, yeah.
I guess you could call it magic or psychical alchemy.
Right. Philosophical alchemy, language alchemy even. Western alchemy is, and again, we have the Eastern alchemy. So we have much more to talk about on alchemy. So yeah, Adam, go ahead and do that, and then we'll close it out for the night. And yeah.
Yeah. So the Philosopher's Stone, talked about it a whole bunch. We all know what it is. It's the thing that lets you do the most amazing things. It'll cure any disease. It'll turn any metal into gold. So this is what people have been looking for centuries and centuries. And kind of a quick rundown on the Philosopher's Stone itself. I mean, it was hard enough just finding a recipe at all. Recipe trading was pretty common among alchemy, like people that were on the ground floor here doing the, making the recipes, putting them together, putting in the lab time. They were always trading recipes with each other, always looking for new places that were selling new recipes, that sort of thing. So people were trying to find recipes for the Philosopher's Stone, always on the lookout for this kind of thing. Now, the problem is, it's kind of too good to be true. And it's hard to say if you're going to pick up a recipe, if you're even going to be able to interpret it, let alone reproduce what the supposed products are. Some people were looking in all these books and trying to attribute these hidden meanings because all these old alchemists that were already obscuring the information in there by using, switching names around or referring to things that you would have to basically know them personally to interpret, that sort of thing. And so it was already not very clear what these alchemists were talking about, which means it was really easy for an alchemist hundreds of years later to interpret a text any way that they wanted, to say, oh, well, what he must have meant by this was actually this. There was this idea that all the adepts say one thing. And so they thought that there was just one Philosopher's Stone recipe, and the adepts, those who had actually made it and knew how to make it, they all knew what the recipe was, and they all did the same thing to do it. It's just that they didn't all explain it in the same way. So some people were looking in books, trying to interpret all these hidden meanings that probably were not there. Some people were looking for, like, they were just looking for masters, these adepts who had already done it, you know, asking around, like traveling, making pilgrimages all over Europe and Asia and North Africa, trying to find somebody who knew how to do this. A lot of people were praying for it, hoping that, like, an angel would basically just tell them how to make it. So, you know, just finding a recipe at all is hard. And they all disagreed, if you were able to find one, on what the starting materials were. Was it gold? Was it antimony? You know, some people were even looking in excrement, because there was this idea that, you know, the starting ingredient is of cheap price and found everywhere. It's trodden underfoot. And then all the coded names and recipes were difficult to sort through. So just trying to, like, pin it down, like, you can see why this was a centuries-long project, is very confusing, probably because you can't really do it. But people were searching. They thought they really could do it. Anyway, what it comes down to is that the actual process of making it was generally agreed on. And how that worked was you took the ingredients and you put it in a glass vessel. And now this glass vessel has a long neck, and at the bottom it has this oval-shaped body. And this was sometimes called, like, the ovum, is egg-shaped, to sort of lend this reproductive imagery. And then what you do is you put the ingredients in there, and then you seal the neck closed, and this was called the seal of Hermes, or hermetically sealed. That's where the word hermetically sealed comes from.
Right.
And so you take this closed off vial and you put it in a furnace and heat it for about a month. Now, I don't know if anybody here has ever heated a closed vessel, but it's not a good idea. Don't try this one at home. There's a lot of, alchemists having this whole thing literally blow up in their faces. But anyway, if you do it right and you heat it at just the right temperature for 30 days, it's going to turn black. And that's when you know it worked and you're on the right track. So it'll turn this pitch dark black. And so that was the signal to continue with the experiment, essentially. So then you continue heating, and the color will eventually change to white. And that is called the white elixir. And that can turn any base metal to silver. But come on, you're already pretty invested. You got it to work. You're not going to stop there. So what do? You just increase the heat, and you keep it going. And eventually it'll turn orange, and it'll turn red. And once it turns red, that's when you know it's ready to pull out. So you take it out of there, and you have to seed it with a little bit of gold, with a little bit of philosopher's mercury, whatever that means. And you melt those together, and you work it up, and the end product is a deep red, a really dense, brittle, meltable stone. And now, in order to use it, you melt down your base metal like lead. You take a little piece of the philosopher's stone, and you throw it in there. You turn up the heat, you mix it all up, and it will convert it into gold. So that's how you do it. You heard it here first at the Paranormies. Make that's philosopher's stone at home.
And don't think of snakes.
Yeah. That's really the most important.
Or monkeys. All right. Well, this was awesome as a primer into getting into more of it. There's so much more to alchemy than this. We talked about so much, but we haven't talked about like the modern alchemy. We need to get into too, because nuclear reactions are basically alchemical reactions. So there's that.
Yeah, very expensive alchemical reactions.
Oh yeah, particle acceleration, that kind of stuff.
But you can do it. You can change one element to another. It's just, it's a pretty penny.
Yeah, I mean, modern. You know, you have modern alchemists like Glenn Seaborg. We haven't talked about. We haven't talked about any of those guys. We haven't talked about Oppenheimer's and their thing. Their deal with transmuting uranium into plutonium, or all that. So we'll get back. We'll do a part 2 of alchemy soon, actually, because I want to get this. I want to get this out of the way and get it all done. Because there's so much more we can talk about. We can talk about, like I said, like J.R.R. Tolkien, and he basically invented an entire world that was based around alchemy, gold and that kind of stuff. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, Adam, for all your prep tonight. Oh,
it was a blast. I was looking forward to doing this one. This is a fun topic. I don't know what it is that just grabs me. I really like reading about it.
Yeah, and we haven't even gotten into Jung's book yet or any of that stuff. So there's so much more to this. But what we're going to do now is we're going to take off, and we'll see you soon. And we're going to take you out with a creepypasta, and we'll see you later.
Time travel makes you gay.
Alchemy does not.
I lay out on the forest floor, my head propped up against the root of a massive redwood. Any hope I once had of escaping this place has long since left me. My stomach rumbles from going days without food. The accident must have broken my back because I've lost all sensation in my legs. The woods are so quiet. For a moment, I try and forget about my troubles and enjoy the serenity around me. But my moment of peace is only fleeting. I can hear the sound of something approaching from the distance. It's faint, but I can tell that my pursuer is trying not to be detected. While waiting for its arrival, I wonder to myself what it could be. A bear? A mountain lion, perhaps? A few minutes later and the mystery is over. I notice from the shadows multiple sets of eyes catching the moonlight peeking in through the treetops. Wolves. A pack of wolves, to be precise. And I can tell they're hungry. They encircle me, cutting off any exit lane. As if a paralyzed man could flee anyways. The pack look ready to kill. They move in closer. But what they don't know is that it won't be me dying in the woods. Not tonight, at least. I'm not the prey. I'm the bait. And there's something much bigger and hungrier out here with us.